Hey there, and welcome to the ID Book Club. Whether you're an avid reader or maybe you're a little bit more hesitant and reluctant to open up and approach those industry standard texts that we know we probably should be reading, no worries. We are here to support you. We are here to hold each other accountable as we not only just try to get our reading done, but also take those awesome insights I know we're about to share and put them into practice, put them into application, see them in our day-to-day, whether we are an inspiring instructional designer or a current instructional designer. And we hope to get you there. Today, we are about to dive right on into chapters 3 through 4 of Cathy Moore's Map It. Now, I'll be honest, there is a ton of content here. Plenty to discuss. But what I'm most excited about is that we finally have the chance to really dig into the practice today in these 2 chapters. Again, a lot there, but we get to consider multiple things like actions, considering like leading a kickoff meeting, or focusing on researching the problem and figuring out how we might go about it providing solutions during consultations with clients or managers. Choosing a mapping tool. Now we actually get into the mapping process. We knew it was coming. It's in the title, Map It. But Cathy has us consider how we go about figuring out what the best approach is using those mapping tools, but also writing goals. Now, all of those actions, that's a ton. That's a lot of content to go through. But again, both of these chapters go together so well that I thought it would be helpful for us to keep them together that way and see how we initiate the kickoff meeting and start leading into being performance consultants that solve problems. But that doesn't mean we're going to forget things like the cultural challenges that we need to consider in approaching these problems and solutions. That doesn't mean we're going to forget that we're trying to define or redefine our role as being problem solvers rather than course creators. But it does mean it's time to apply. And this is when things really get real. In fact, in order for us to see how real it truly gets, Cathy presents us with an opportunity to, let's just say, feel the weight of what we're about to go through. And she gives us this pretty audacious goal, and that is this. You are the last defense. You're the one remaining hero who can save thousands of innocent people from a pointless information dump. And we appreciate her humor. At the same time, that seems a little intimidating. It seems a little intense. But we can go about that through multiple ways. In fact, really, we can do this with what I think is the most simplest and most actionable tip in this entire section. And that is this: banish course from your vocabulary. We know that Cathy is a little adverse to the word course, and we should be too, if we're really trying to figure out what the problem is and be a performance consultant. And I should have made a tally of how many times that she tells us to not say the word course, or not focus on the course, or not think about the course. Focus on the solution, focus on the problem in order to get there. And in fact, really, it's too early to identify any solution. She goes on to say that often the client who asks for a course just hasn't diagnosed their problem. Like, it doesn't make sense to give course a solution if you don't know what the problem is, if you haven't done the analysis, if you haven't evaluated the situation to see what is really necessary in order to, bring better performance and solve those business problems that we might face. And we can fix that. Right? She gives us the tips and steps to go through that process. And it all starts with, that kickoff meeting. And she tells us we really need to focus on preparing ourselves to problem solve. Presenting ourselves to problem solve within the first 10 minutes of that meeting. That means we really have to establish that's our role, that's our goal. And that's hard to do. One of the first things that comes out of a client's mouth, a manager's mouth, may be, we need a course, but how do we respond to that? Well, she gives us multiple ways of addressing that through dialogue examples, which I highly suggest you go back through and read in chapters 3 and later in 4 as well. But we have to present ourselves as problem solvers within the first 10 minutes. That's how crucial it is within this kickoff meeting. And within that first 10 minutes as well, we need to determine the problem within the first 10 minutes. Maybe not to the full extent, but we do so by asking questions and questions and more questions. She even gives us a little recipe of how to address, that initializing conversation of we need a course and all the different questions that may come out of that without even having to use the word course itself. And really, Cathy suggests that we need to have the client really see the need for the analysis and need for solving the problem themselves. And they need to see all this for themselves rather than us just giving them the answers, right? We need to guide and lead them there. That's where that performance consultant idea comes into play. So we're setting expectations, having an agenda going into this kickoff meeting is very important and crucial. She gives us some examples of what that might look like. We need to develop goals, not performance goals, not goals that we're going to act on to solve the problem, but what is the goal of our meeting? And the goal of our meeting, again, is not to just say, yes, we'll do a course for you, but it's to consider the approach. How are we going to address, pushback from potential clients or those who are higher up who are asking for a course? Well, do you be blunt? Or do you act a little bit more subtly? There's a couple conversation models and examples she gives us. She does suggest that we not be so blunt and tell them, no, you don't need a course, but we can navigate those conversations by using some of her examples and not even having to use the word course itself and asking more questions and having those expectations set from the very beginning. Now, again, it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of case, but using her examples should be pretty helpful. So we prepare ourselves to problem solve by preparing for that kickoff meeting first and foremost, but what's the next steps from there? She gives us some suggestions that, yes, spend the first 10 minutes of that kickoff meeting establishing yourself and your role as a problem solver, determining what that problem is. But after that, after you leave that initial kickoff meeting and schedule something for later to go into more detail and implement this action mapping process, the next step is on your own. We need to know our client, right? Research is your friend. Spend like 1 to 2 hours, she suggests, on figuring out, okay, how can we measure the problem? Do they already have things they're measuring? Can we research the client on our own to figure out what some of their obstacles may be? Beyond that too, how can we solve the problem? Can we research a possible solution that's already been implemented? Like, that's going to give us data points, that's going to give us examples that we could bring to the next meeting and use as leverage there to say, here's why maybe a course isn't the solution, or here's where we should go based on what you've seen others do. And then that might not come into play, Cathy suggests, but that's a good tool to have in your back pocket, especially when trying to navigate these tough conversations. And in fact, the biggest tip of all is, as you're doing this preparation, as you are preparing for a longer meeting and consulting on the performance problem, don't forget the meeting isn't about you. And definitely not about the course, right? That helps protect us from maybe the personal reaction we might have when there is pushback and saying, no, we need a course. But remember, what's the meeting about? You're leading it, but really you're just there to ask questions. You're there to get the client to see, because the meeting's all about the client and the problem, get the client to see what the problem is themselves through your guiding questions, through that problem-solving process and mindset that needs to be clearly established from the beginning. And in leading that meeting, again, it is not just being a participant. We do need to take an active role in that, but that active role doesn't have to be demanding what the solution is. That active role comes through asking questions, determining a mapping software or whiteboard or wall. She gives us options. It doesn't have to just be something on the computer. Of course, if it's a remote situation, that would probably make the most sense, but it could just be a whiteboard. It could be pass out the sticky notes and put them on the wall. You might not be able to connect the actions to the specific goal in that clear format, but it gives us that visual, something to hone on to really show that the performance goal needs to be in the center, which we'll talk about in a second. She asks us to use phrases like, help me understand. Help me understand what the problem is. Help me understand what an obstacle might be. Help me understand what this looks like on the day-to-day job. Those types of questions or requests will, again, help train and guide the client or the manager to see what the problem solution is, not just that they need a course. as well as using phrases like, we're going to end up with a lot of ideas. And that's a good thing. Not that we're going to choose all the ideas to focus on to solve the problem, but the fact that the course is not the only idea. The course is not the only solution. But beyond using phrases like that, we really have to focus on those two steps in this process. We're not going to do the whole action mapping process in this one meeting, but what we are going to do is determine the goal and figure out the action. Goal and action, that's huge to this part of the initial meetings and establishing where we're going from here, and this really sets the tone for the rest of the project. In fact, she gives us a very clear, as we're looking at chapter 4, one last piece here, how do we write that goal? Now, this is templated, but at the same time, it gives us all the necessary components we might consider. We need to figure out a measure that we already use, the company already uses, will increase or decrease a specific number percentage by a specific date as people in a specific group do something on the job. So that's 4 clear components of this business goal that has to be in the center of the action mapping process. And she gives us some tips to focus on there. It's not to say one is more important than the other, although there are some suggestions that she offers that maybe help us see where we really need to go and where we need to start with. In fact, writing that business goal, we might ask, what are they currently measuring that they want to improve when the problem is solved? If that's already there, then that's a helpful metric because they already showing that it's important enough for them to consider already. Maybe the solution is the problem, not so much what they're trying to measure. Although if there's nothing being measured, that's probably a good starting place as well. Tie the goal to people's values. If you're getting pushback from others, again, help them see where this problem is hurting them the most. Tie it to their values to see how finding this solution and specifically addressing the actions that need to be fixed or modified are going to lead them to better results. Tie the goal to people's values, and then choose a specific audience. You'll notice that was the last out of those 4 components there. But I think Cathy would argue trainings, especially courses, are often one size fits all. That's not a specific audience. In fact, you're going to get a lot of reluctant audiences that aren't going to be affected by the training in the way they should because they're not really who it's targeted for. So choosing that specific audience helps us let that goal be more human-centered. And at the end of the day, if we're trying to modify actions and behaviors, well, who are the ones doing the actions and behaviors? It's the audience. So they have to come first in mind in terms of determining this business goal. And then write the goal in the middle of the map. That's like one of the final steps there in this initial meeting is putting it right there in the middle of the map so we can figure out what actions are going to come from that goal. That is so crucially important. That ties everything back to that goal, measurable metrics, by a certain time, by a certain percentage, and most importantly, for a specific group of people who need this training if that's the case or need the solution to whatever the performance problem is. Now, that gives us a lot to think about, doesn't it? There are multiple things that Cathy brings up here, but let's discuss this. Let's get ready to give some thought questions so we can consider where do we go from here. So first question I would have us consider is, well, one, how do we get the client to change their own mind? We know that we could try to offer a suggestion for a solution right in the beginning, but the goal is to have the client see the importance of this performance problem and how we can find a solution that best fits the need there. How do we get them to change their own mind? How do we guide them in that way? I'm sure you have some maybe on-the-job examples. Love to hear them. That's our first thought question. Second thought question, though, we might want to consider is why use a mapping tool in the first place? Now I know the title of the book, Map It, we knew it was coming, but Cathy doesn't really actually preface why we use one. But hopefully you're able to see quite clearly why it's so necessary. What ideas do we have that we can consider that show why a mapping tool is so important in this process? And then finally, just one more for us to consider. How does choosing a specific audience affect performance goals and just affect performance overall? Why is that audience piece so important? We know one size does not fit all in terms of training or any kind of solution, but what about these specific audiences? How does choosing that matter? Can't wait to hear your insightful ideas as we jump into those discussion groups. Be ready to share out on that as we meet back on the main stage, and we'll see where we go from there. Let's discuss chapters 3 through 4 of Map It. If you didn't hear me preface the question, I'll do a little bit of that first, but I'm sure you all came up with some awesome insights. Saw a lot of people at this table. How do we get a client to change their mind? Right? That's the task that Cathy Moore is presenting before us for these kickoff meetings. It's not to, just like you would with the information dump, force information upon a client or force a solution upon them, but the goal is to train them to almost come to that themselves in some ways. But how do we get there? How do we do that? And how do we avoid that word that we're not supposed to say in those meetings? Course.
This is such a ID question, huh?
Yes.
Changing minds. So, Cathy Moore gives us great examples about how to do this. And when I mean this, is something I refer to as verbal judo. And I did not coin this term. I learned it from my supervisor, right? So she gives us some very good verbal judo techniques. You look at page 47, there's kind of like placating to the, I guess, your audience, if you will, in the kickoff meeting, right? So, for example, I'd be delighted to talk about that. And then she can shift it to sort of like her advantage point, So this is just a common human sort of behavioral sort of activity, right? So there's no getting a black belt in it. You just, dive in there and do your human thing, right? But another interesting thing I want to point out is even in the world of instructional design, there's some contention with this. Like, should we focus on changing the mind? Is it a behavioral change? Is it habitual change? So there's other sort of things to consider when you're sort of delving into how I communicate. What am I communicating? But luckily, thankfully, Cathy Moore gives us these great examples. Page 77's got a great example on metrics as well. So there you go.
Yes, and that's what we're thankful for, right? That's what the text is so helpful in giving us these really applicable, and I think the pages you're referring to there, she gives us the recipe, right, to follow for these conversations. And that conversation, again, is not saying this is the answer to your problems. I was reminded of this as, being a former high school teacher myself, ask a question to students and they just get frustrated because, just give us the answer, right? Just give us the answer. But that's not the goal here either, right? We're going to lead them to the answer and we'll work together for that. But as you look through that recipe, you'll notice it's never about answer giving. It's about problem solving through asking questions and through using that. I like what you called it there, verbal judo. Thanks, Thomas. Appreciate that. Any other thoughts on that? That's such a crucially important part of this process is the conversation piece. It's the leading clients to that moment where they can see that the performance problem will not be answered or addressed by a course, or at least a course alone, or that's the only answer to the problem. And I saw some interesting questions in the chat too, like what if it's a graphic or a design issue? Again, I think that's something else that this whole kickoff meeting is about, is trying to get to the root of the problem to build out a goal. And maybe, again, the goal itself to address the performance issue, it's not necessarily going to be a course or a training. It's leading them to see maybe there's something even slight, whether it's a design or graphic issue or something else that could lead us there. Discussion is totally the same. I agree there, Laurel. It's just what's the content that we're dealing with, what's the source of the problem. Conversation is still going to get to hopefully get them to the point where they are realizing that there's a problem here, and we can fix that problem by having a very clear and articulated goal. We also want to talk about how we get there, and this is where I thought it was interesting. Cathy Moore doesn't really preface anything here for us for starting this action mapping process. And now, again, I know we missed this with the conversation, but she really only has focus on 2 steps, right? That is identifying the goal and looking at the actions. There's more to it than that, but what did your conversations lead you to for this question? Why use a mapping tool in the first place in this kickoff meeting, in this initiating phase of addressing this performance problem? What does this mapping process do that maybe others don't. And remember, it doesn't have to be using a digital tool. She gives us options of using like whiteboards or walls if we need to. There's all sorts of options there, and I'd be interested to hear what you all have used if you've used this approach before. But why use this mapping process in the first place?
Some of the things that I don't think we did talk about that just dawn on me as we're sitting here is there's an opportunity to be more egalitarian when you're using mapping tools. So I tend to be vocal and I tend to not shut up, and I'm aware of that. And sometimes in meetings, I know that I need to step back to allow other voices to come forward. And one of the advantages of a mapping tool is it gives you the opportunity to be a little more egalitarian and to balance out some of those things. Everyone has their stack of Post-it notes. Everyone has a pen. They can all write them down. There's less of the people who are shy, not wanting to speak up, introverts feeling uncomfortable, or those of us who are mouthy overtaking the entire conversation. Electronic mapping tools allow you to document the whole process and refer back to it, which can hold people accountable to what they said or what was decided. And again, as Dana mentioned, it gives you the opportunity to organize all of the thoughts that have been recorded, whether it's digital or some analog format. So I think those are the three big things for me. And it's fun.
Yeah, and it's fun too. It gives us a visual, right? And that even that piece itself is a little bit more interactive. And I love what you brought up there too, in regards to just, everyone is involved in that process. And she makes it very clear to us. I didn't get to share this quote with us earlier, but that this is not about you, right? This is not about, like, you are leading this kickoff meeting. You need to make sure that you do manage your client so that a course really is taken off the table as that initial option and result. But at the same time, you're not making it about you. You're making it about solving that problem. And I think these mapping tools really get us there too, right?
And it can be extremely helpful if there's a hippo in the room. The highest paid person's opinion, who often wins. Again, it comes back to that sort of egalitarian, everyone's Post-it notes are equal.
I love that. Yeah. I love looking at it from that perspective too, because these are some of the things that we might miss when we're reading through this text. We know that's the end goal, is to get to that action mapping process, but why? And I think you totally gave us so many things to think about, Laurel. Appreciate it. Okay, so we want to get the client to change their own mind, obviously through some, interventionary methods of guiding them there. And part of that is this maybe action mapping process that we're taking a look at. And I love that too. Really great for introverts, possibly. And I get it. I'm one too. But that gives us something to circle around for these conversations as well too, to visualize it, to see it all laid out there. And again, documentation doesn't hurt either, so you can have that level of accountability and go back to it and focus on those actions to get us to that next step, which that leads us really to another one of our questions. I think Laurel focused on how this allows all to be a part of this process. But what about the learners on the other side? What about the audience as we're crafting these goals, as we're trying to determine a way to solve this problem? How does choosing a specific audience affect performance goals? That's one of these many elements within these goals. If you think back to what Cathy has given us as a little bit of a template to follow, to plug things in. Yes, measurable results and time and actual numbers are important, but it all comes down toward the end on what is this specific audience going to do. And so as we talked about that at our tables, I know we had a couple there. Any insights we want to share on how this choosing of a specific audience matters?
I don't have too much expertise in this area, but I guess I can point us to some direction. But page 79 talks about that, right? Choosing a specific audience.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if this is referring to Cathy Moore's example of, what was it, McScrooge, like hoarding the budget money, right? So your audience could be the Scrooge, or your audience can be, and I was a former K-12 teacher as well. Like, if you could choose that audience, right? And it can be wild. It can be, sort of easy to deal with. It's going to be a mixed bag. So this idea is foreign to me, choosing your audience, right? But I just wanted to say, this is sort of where Cathy Moore directed me, like from page 79 on. But there's really nothing much I could sort of share other than that.
Yeah. And I think when it comes down to it is like, it depends on what the performance problem is. Because it could be something that is widespread, that an organization that needs to be solved that way. But I think, again, she focuses there on like page 80 and like that same section referring to Thomas on like, what if the client still wants one solution for everybody, like one size fits all? That ends up being the problem. And that could still solve some issues. But it's also, as some people in the chat were saying, it may totally waste some of the audience's time because it doesn't apply to them, right? Give the opportunity either for the audience who it does apply to be able to take in whatever behavioral change that might be. But if there's people who don't need to make that change, then we have to consider that. And that hopefully those are all things that are addressed in that initial meeting and not way down the line after some solution is come to. So yeah, appreciate that. Appreciate those insights, Thomas. And yeah, as a lot of other people were saying, the goals really should be designed for the audience. As much as we focus on metrics and numbers and results, that of course is key. But if we're focusing on what people do, you can't have an action without an audience, right? And a specific audience who is going to be able to go through that behavioral change if that solution is really worthwhile and action-driven and hopefully provides those results. So that takes us through the kickoff meeting. That takes us through writing an initial goal as a team, as a group. You're leading that, but at the same time, what comes next? And that's what we're going to start taking a look at next week as we have opportunity to. So we're going to look at chapters 5 and 6. And again, moving past that kickoff meeting, focusing on what do they actually need to do. We'll dig into those goals a little bit more, focus more on the actions, and figure out, okay, if they're not doing this certain action, how do we get them there? And we also have opportunity, if you aren't able to join us, to jump into tables for the ID Community Reading Hour every Thursday at 5. That's our goal as well. So next week, 5 through 6, we're plugging on through, getting to more of those actionable tips that Cathy gives us. And hopefully I'll have solved and come up with a solution to that performance problem, and we won't have those issues next time. But thank you all for being here. I'll be in those tables here in a second. We can chat and talk a little bit further, but I appreciate you all and look forward to next week. Have a good day. See you later.